looks like it's get started in a couple seconds. Actually, I can get started now because it's recorded. All right, so let me launch the final lecture. And we have week 12. So welcome to the last lecture. This is Information System Security and Management, and I want to pull up the speaker notes, which requires a couple of clicks. And this is another one of the double lectures from making it a 14-week, compressing it to a 12-week class. So plenty of material this week to go through. So we're going to be talking about information security policy and security awareness. So let me get started. Let's see. You can't expect anyone to adhere to policies and best practices if you do not actually have them written down and published. Most organizations are required, whether by regulatory authority or their industry or by self-imposed decisions, to review and publish at least 2 policy documents every year, a WISP and a SIRP. The WISP is a written information security policy, and a SIRP is a security incident response plan. In some situations, there are maybe 30 or so policy documents that break out the specific details of information security policy and incident response policy. And some appointed group within the organization must be responsible for approving the documents as official corporate policy. This lecture dives into the not so exciting world of policy documentation and the role it plays in information security management. At the end of the day, if there is an incident and you have followed your documented policies leading up to and including during that incident, then you have protected your organization to the extent possible and have achieved a defensible position with regard to regulatory penalty and potential legal or criminal litigation. Information security policy is essentially a set of policies, rules, and guidelines published by an organization related to information technology and users. Information security policy is a set of policies issued by an organization to ensure that all information technologies users within the domain of the organization or its networks comply with rules and guidelines related to the security of the information stored digitally at any point in the network or within the organization's boundaries of authority. Every organization needs to protect its data and also control how it should be distributed, both within and without the organizational boundaries. This may mean that information may have to be encrypted, authorized through a third party or institution, and may have restrictions placed on its distribution with reference to a classification system laid out in the information security policy. So the WISP and the SIRP, 2 documents. I believe that this is the minimum number of information security documents. Technically, you could have, you could combine them, I guess, but revising and updating them and having them approved will be harder given that the combined scope of a single information security policy document is obviously larger than 2 documents. These documents, if they don't exist in your organization, will likely pull some content out of the employee handbook or HR policy for employees. Be sure to work closely with the HR team if that is the case and you're writing your information security policy for the first time. Cross-references might be needed within each document to avoid duplication of content or, worse yet, inconsistent policy between the documents. Shown here, a list of potentially the 30-document approach. The above policies and documents here are many of the basic guidelines available to build a successful security program. There are several of these policies and documents that a CISO will develop and add to the initial baseline of 2 documents as their organization matures and the security program expands. Which ones you select depend on your industry, your company size, and reasons for creating a formal policy document to address a specific risk or regulatory requirement or internal audit and compliance effort. Guiding questions. So can this policy be implemented? Both from a technical and legal perspective. So is there knowledge, skill, and experience available to support this implementation and the implementation of a particular policy? Does the legal team support the policy and its implications? The precise wording of a policy is very important. Instituting a policy of website content blocking can, if worded poorly, open up a company to litigation, such as a case where a company security policy stated pornographic sites will be blocked and they cannot be accessed from the corporate network. A court ruled that the company was liable for breach of contract because it did not block all so-called questionable sites. So by instituting a policy stating that it would filter out these sites, the company was accepting responsibility, quote unquote, for the successful execution of this activity and was therefore accountable. The damage award, as well as the reimbursement for the employee's distress, was based on this finding. So it's worse to have a policy that you're not inconsistent with. Actually, no, it's actually worse to have no policy at all, because then the sort of then the basic best practices will come to apply, and you don't want that applied if you haven't actually met them, right, with your implementation. All right. So guiding questions, part 2. Is it clear who's responsible for what? All employees must have their respective roles outlined in the policy. All these questions must be answered in the security policy. 1, who's going to implement the policy? 2, who's going to enforce the policy? 3, who's going to maintain security hardware and software? 4, or 3, no, 1, 2, 3, 4, who's going to perform security checks and audits? And lastly, 5, what is the system administrator responsible for? Maybe 6 as well. What are the network administrator and security manager's responsibilities? And of course, 7, what are the end users' responsibilities? If you don't actually dictate and write them out, people may not know what they are. For example, here a perfect example of a no smoking area where someone's smoking. If you don't publish the sign, people don't know that that's the policy, and they don't know that they're required. Sorry. They don't know if they're required to adhere to it if it's not posted and they're not, given training on it, for example. And of course, one of the other guiding questions is, if implemented, will this be enforceable? Will management of the legal department support the effort? Will they enforce disciplinary measures and implications of policy violations? Without management support, it is a waste of time to implement a security policy. Employees will sometimes defy security and policies, whether intentionally or unintentionally. Having prohibitive measures in place to enforce policy, such as a DNS firewall, is a significant factor to consider. Having tools which prohibit using the same password on 2 different sites or application logins is another great example. Merely monitoring or alerting on policy violations is reactive in nature, and InfoSec needs to be proactive wherever possible and prudent. One other guiding question: why do we need a WISP, right? A security policy serves many functions. It is a central document that describes in detail acceptable network activity and penalties for misuse. A security policy also provides a forum for identifying and clarifying security goals and objectives to the organization as a whole. A good security policy shows employees how she or he is responsible for helping to maintain a secure environment. Security policies also serve as a good foundation for conducting audits of the network and its resources. It serves as a baseline to follow when trying to uncover vulnerabilities or when conducting forensics activities if security has been breached. All right, so let's talk about the WISP, the Written Information Security Policy. I use the acronym here to refer to, of course, the Written Information Security Policy. Businesses that have not implemented a WISP are playing a risky game. Security incidents happen every day. Furthermore, they don't only happen to the careless. In hacker culture, the harder the target, the greater the challenge and potential notoriety. For the businesses whose security is breached, when regulators or prosecutors come knocking, the worst possible posture is to not have a WISP in place. The second worst posture, however, is to have a really nice WISP tucked in a drawer somewhere with no indication that it was ever implemented. The danger of a WISP is in thinking that it is enough on its own. So what are some of the characteristics of a WISP? It should be end-to-end. It should be revised annually. It should incorporate the risk assessment of the organization, and it should be practical and enforceable. The WISP should secure the organization from all ends. It should cover all software, hardware, devices, physical parameters, human resource, information data, access control, policies, and procedures within its scope. So here I have a picture of the Dungeons and Dragons Advanced D&D Player's Handbook. That's sort of a little bit of what we're going for with talking about WISP characteristics and being end-to-end. One quick aside on the D&D side of things, you may be familiar with character, what is it called? When you create a character in Dungeons and Dragons, you decide where to put that character on a moral axis. Are you good, evil, or morally neutral? Simple enough. But then you have to decide where your character fits on a law-abiding axis. Do you always obey the law? Or are you neutral about the law? Or are you chaotic? And do you believe that laws are meant to be broken? So in this case, a good example, is lawful good, Superman. Good neutral is Captain Kirk in Star Trek, right? The Prime Directive. And then, of course, chaotic good would be Robin Hood, right? Stealing from the rich and giving to the poor. Neutral lawful would be Javert from Les Mis. And neutral would be the Oracle from The Matrix, right? Just a program that's trying to balance an equation. And of course, chaotic neutral, an example of that would be Omar from The Wire. And let's see, evil lawful would be Napoleon from the book Animal Farm. And neutral evil would be Voldemort from Harry Potter. In this case, he's neutral because he understands the balance of power, but he is evil. And so he's breaking the law sometimes, essentially, right? Not lawful, but not chaotic either. And of course, chaotic evil would be an example, would be the Joker from Batman. So what are some of the elements of a WISP? Well, we need to speak about the purpose of the WISP, the audience and scope. We need to speak and address in the WISP objectives so that those are explicit and outlined. We also need to, of course, identify authority and access control. And of course, can't have a good security policy without data classification, right? That was one of the first lectures in the course. Data operations help you turn that operational into a real operating procedure and way of working. SOPs, standard operating procedures, and how-to articles. And of course, security awareness should be a part of any WISP so that people know that that's addressed, because that's an important aspect to any security program. And of course, a section should be very explicit about outlining the responsibilities of all of the parties involved, including contractors, as well as consultants and staff. A security policy can essentially be as broad as you want it to be, from everything related to IT security to the security of related physical assets. Let's take a look at some of the elements that should be included in a WISP. Sorry, I do not know why. I have so many yawns in me this afternoon. Maybe because I need to drink a cup of espresso. I don't have it, I just have water, so. I'll have to soldier forward without the coffee. All right, so what is the purpose, right? Well, these are the elements. I'm going to go through the bullet list that we saw a minute ago. Of course, you need to explicitly state as to why the policy was created and to clarify any possible ambiguities. Some possible purposes: create an overall approach to information security. Another possible purpose: detect and preempt information security breaches, such as the misuse of networks, data, applications, and computer systems. Another possible purpose: maintain the reputation of the organization and uphold ethical and legal responsibilities. And lastly, another possible purpose would be to respect customer rights, including how to react to inquiries and complaints about non-compliance. Your, of course, policy can address some or all of these. And of course, this is, purpose. I thought it would be funny to put in a picture of, what's his name? Forky, right? He's a spork. He's a spoon and a fork. Great movie if you haven't seen it. All right, next, the audience for the WISP. You need to define the audience for whom the information security policy applies. Depending on the size of your organization, there might be different WISPs for different business units. Think of Intel Corporation, for example. They have massive, different policy documents and different units and written information security policies for chip and fab manufacturing versus, software development, for example, or data center operations could be entirely different. You might also have a separate WISP for consultants than for employees because of the rights and benefits and expectations of each. The scope of the document, of course, will define the audience. Our third parties, such as partners and affiliates, also included. Clearly state the audience for the document early on in the document. Next up, the objectives of the WISP. Specific outcomes, of course, for high-level objectives applicable to InfoSec and the core tenets of availability, integrity, and confidentiality. The objectives of the policy should be clearly defined at the beginning of the document after the introductory pages. If there are any disparate views within an organization about the role that information security plays, the statement of the objects and objectives in the WISP should address them. Does InfoSec have the ability to block or veto projects or components of projects or features of projects? If so, then how and when can they be overridden? Or does the InfoSec program only advise and consult the organization, leaving decisions to the executive team and the business to decide whether to accept a particular risk? And so in this case, InfoSec is simply analyzing and providing guidance, but the business is the one that takes decisions. I think that's a fairly mature way to go about it because in many cases, risky businesses are profitable and successful and disruptive. And if business wants to run that way, the InfoSec team should document, document the various risks that they have identified, but not necessarily be in a position to veto, unless it's a complete egregious violation of norms and practices that they know would end the company's existence, right? Sort of existential threats. Let's see, authority. What is the authority of the document? How the InfoSec program is located within the organizational hierarchy, right, identifies the source of its authority. The CISO can report to various roles, such as the CEO, the CTO, the CIO, the CFO, the COO, the Chief Operating Officer, or even the Chief Risk Officer, if there is one. While it's true that InfoSec needs to have a broad base of support to work with the key stakeholders in the organization, there are some specific patterns of interaction that logically follow from where the program is homed. The WISP needs to call out which group maintains the policy and by which authority the policy is approved and its provisions enforced. Information security organization design is influenced by a host of factors specific to each enterprise that must be well understood before the adopted structure can work optimally. I myself have reported to the CIO or the CTO previously in different organizations, and there can be potential conflicts of interest depending on the nature of that relationship or the nature of the business or even the nature of the industry in which the business operates. Oftentimes in financial services, for example, they want the CISO to have much more autonomy, but potentially to be tied into like a compliance officer type role, right? Like a chief risk officer, or potentially someone in legal. And so for these reasons, they may not be tied into the tech organization through CIO and CTO type reporting lines. And it's definitely the case that when CISOs get together and have boot camps and gatherings and summits, that is oftentimes a point of discussion. What are some of the benefits, the pros and cons of different reporting lines? Data classification. All security policy and tooling begins with data classification and classification of data. And then we figure out how much time and effort to put into protecting it. We've spent time on this already in a few lectures, but it's the WISP that actually contains the data classifications, which informs the measures that need to be applied to ensure the availability, integrity, and confidentiality of the data and the information systems upon which it runs. Data owners need to be identified as well, and applications will normally have both technical owners and business owners. The general ledger of the organization is owned usually by the finance team, but the applications that make up the finance team's workflow will be run by perhaps an enterprise IT team. This team is quite often separate from other IT functions of revenue generating units, for example, your typical engineering teams, for example. The WISP should also provide detailed examples of each kind of data classification so as not to leave their definitions open to interpretation and thereby misunderstanding. In terms of data classification, I thought it'd be fun to pull out redacted memo about Kennedy that was processed, I guess, by guessing the FBI or something like that, right? So let's see. Mr. James Dow, departmental attorney who has handled the Hoffa case in Florida, dropped by yesterday and spoke with Linebaugh in my office. Mr. Dow met the director recently, blah, blah, blah. Dow said that in 1959, just prior to leaving practice in New Jersey, he had met blah, 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 redacted, their conversation turned to politics and expressed concern over Senator Kennedy's presidential aspirations. He said that he felt Kennedy was extremely vulnerable and showed damn poor judgment. But anyway, so this is a little bit about, obviously, redacted classification of data and declassification of data. Data operations, all right? We can have a policy, but we still need, in classification, but we still need to operationalize it. So encryption at rest and in transit, these are some of the aspects of data operations that have to be dealt with in the WISP. You also need to have data handling procedures for GDPR, for example. And of course, you can't have good data handling without a good data dictionary, data mappings, and data encoding standards. The WISP needs to declare, to the extent possible, what specific data encryption protocols, ciphers, and key lengths should be used when working with sensitive information. It should also provide a foundation for data dictionaries and data mapping for compliance reasons, which data maps to different data privacy laws like GDPR and CCPA, et cetera, and data encoding standards. So one example, elliptic curve Diffie-Hellman allows microprocessors to securely determine a shared secret key while making it very difficult for a bad actor to determine that same shared key. And I think what I pulled out here was a visualization of Diffie-Hellman's elliptical curve and how the different data is used to protect it. It's one of the stronger protocols and ciphers, actually cipher suites to be used. ECDH, I think, is an abbreviation for it. And of course, when that's to be applied and when maybe less strong ciphers are used. One section of the written information security policy should address security awareness. So you need to be conducting training sessions, right, to inform employees of these security procedures at least once a year, best practices and controls. Phishing tests are also included in this. OWASP top 10 training to make sure that the developers know how to address the OWASP top 10 vulnerabilities. We talked previously also about the CIS top 20 as being the basic standards by which most security programs would be judged, including CCPA, addressing all of those. And so you can have workshops, lunch and learns, things like that, tabletop exercises and other activities. These should be included in the WISP in order to document the fact that there is a security awareness program. In order to take advantage of the requirement to read and acknowledge receipt of these policies, you can include them in the document. According to a proof point survey, 95% of survey respondents said their organization delivers phishing awareness training. That's great. And the vast majority, 84% of organizations using them, said employee awareness improved following the implementation of a consequence model, meaning failing the test has some kind of consequence. It's not just informational. An average of a 12% failure rate for phishing tests was seen back at this time. Although I think that with COVID, if I understand it correctly, it's gone up to about 17 to 19% failure rate because of the work from home conditions, people being fatigued, people having poor judgment or being distracted instead of being in the office and focused, for example. And so that's been reflected in a industry-wide increase in failures of phishing tests. I always perform, or not always, I like to perform my phishing tests monthly. Some people think that's too often, but here's a graph that I found which showed that monthly is 38% and twice per month is actually 23%. So that means there's a lot of organizations that are doing pretty frequently testing, and that's great, right? Because that's flexing the muscle, exercising the muscle. It doesn't atrophy. Sending a phishing awareness test, a phishing test once a year is silly. but there are some that do it 6% of companies. Some of the ones vary a little bit based on, oh wait, no, it's not the industry slide. This one's different. This one talks about consequences for in-person training. So the question, and repeat offenders, the question of carrot versus stick, right? There's different approaches to user security mistakes. And at least elicits, some pretty vehement responses from advocates on both sides, actually, each with fairly credible arguments. So no matter where you stand, you should be informed and thoughtful about consequence models. A punishment approach could lead users to equate security awareness training initiatives with distrust, fear, and even anger. And they may potentially try to avoid or game the system. I prefer to actually gamify security awareness, where you actually take departments and compete against one another to improve their collective score on these monthly phishing tests. So when you have information from building up the recipients list for different phishing tests, you can put engineering against sales, or you can put legal against finance, right? And you can find out who's more susceptible. Obviously, some people have more sensitive data within each of these departments or between groups. But it's definitely more fun, in my experience, to get people to appreciate the humor and value of the test rather than to punish them and say, oh, like have a 3 strikes and you're fired kind of approach. I just think that's not the good idea. Why? Well, you can't fire yourself to a more secure company, right? Everyone that's going to come in is going to be susceptible to some of the same phishing tests that you may have fired someone for clicking on. And so rather than have negative consequence, I like to have positive consequence. Maybe you can get eligibility for an additional performance bonus annually based on good behavior, maybe failing no tests at all, for example, throughout the year. All right, so outlining responsibilities in the WISP. You need to be explicit in the document to assign specific staff. Named individuals can't be in the document because they'll come and go, but specific roles to carry out user access reviews, to carry out the education program for phishing awareness I was just talking about, for example, change management to make sure, because that's certainly the domain of InfoSec, to make sure the SDLC process is properly documented, right, for availability and oversight and auditability. And of course, incident management flows right in the heart of the WISP and the SERP, of course. Implementation responsibilities, who actually implements various tools. One of the pathologies I've noticed in large and small organizations is that people will build things and then they will sort of hand them over to no one, right? It just kind of gets built and then the development team goes and does something else. And they don't actually operationalize it and formally transition it to business as usual, right? BAU, and make it a part of someone's explicit responsibilities for maintaining the tool that just got launched or the rule that got written, right, in the DLP system, things like that. And of course, in the responsibility section, you have to say who's going to update the security policy and how often and who signs off on it. The WISP needs to convey the message, essentially, in my mind, that it's everyone's responsibility to protect the organization from risk, from attack, and from failure. But it's also critical to produce a list of assigned individuals or roles for the security incident response team or the review of application rights and user entitlements, right? Normally, it's going to be a VP of engineering and a head of HR. They're going to review who has access to those systems. Could be a controller or somebody in the accounting team that looks into who has access to the financial services systems that make up the company. And of course, auditing the change control requests and documentation of incident response. All of this should be very explicitly called out in the WISP. And here's a picture of some Meerkats, right? It's everyone's responsibility to keep the Meerkats safe. They're always up and looking around and signaling and warning each other when there's threats on the horizon. That should be the goal of every InfoSec program, that it's not just people with the word security in their title, it's everyone. All right, so we're doing fine. We're going to go into the SERP now, right? No other single policy document will likely carry more significance and practical impact than how well is written your SERP, your Security Incident Response Policy or Plan. If you have any kind of regulatory requirement, and these days, who's not impacted by at least PCI or CCPA, for example, then you'll need to have this to be your strongest piece of documentation. And it needs to be a living, breathing document. It should be updated annually at the very least. But you can expect for it to need to be updated quarterly to keep up with some of the changes in the organization. Changes in escalation policy and procedure for identifying and declaring a security incident or a breach. And of course, practicing the art of incident response. The security incident response policy needs to include an incident response plan and breach notification procedures. Very explicit, easy to follow rules. The purpose of the SIRP is to describe and document the agreed upon procedures for identifying, managing, investigating, and remediating various types of incidents and alerts that lead to incidents. It describes the tasks for initiating an investigation of a reported event and eventual declaration of an incident if warranted. Not all alerts and reported security events will result in the declaration of an incident. And a Dilbert comic here for our incident response plan goes something like this: help, help. All right, security incident response plan usually follows the 6 phases of incident response, or at least that's a reasonably good way to structure the document after those introductory sections that I mentioned for audience and purpose and objectives. And again, 6 phases of incident response are preparation, identification, containment, eradication, recovery, and lessons learned. So we already spent a whole lecture on the topic of incident response plans. So this discussion, we're going to look a little bit more focused on the documentation aspects of the policy and plan. So let's take a look at some of the potential stated goals or objectives of the SERP. Incident response policy is intended to minimize interruptions in service to the business. Remember the availability part of the triad of AIC. It's also meant to document the occurrence of the incident and the actions taken in response. The response policy should determine and report what occurred and how it occurred. And of course, it needs to obtain and preserve information regarding the incident. You don't want people to just delete stuff that showed up in the email that was malicious. You may need it for forensics later. And of course, you need to determine the known facts of the incident and communicate those to the business during the incident as well as after. And of course, it should determine the timeline of events, right, that transpired during the incident. So when you do a root cause analysis of an outage, whether it's due to an attack or due to a bad code deploy or simply something breaking because of a third-party provider having an incident, the root cause analysis definitely needs to have a timeline, just so that people can understand, looking at it, where it could be improved, right? Where could the response times be improved? Maybe there's a 2-hour period where no one took a decision to move to the next phase, and they could have or should have. Or maybe there was a very good reason why it took 2 hours or 4 hours, to transition from one phase of incident response to another. And the timeline should help indicate why that's the case. Of course, you determine the timeline, and then establish a basis for making operational business decisions that cause a positive outcome from the incident response. What are the lessons learned? How do you make sure it doesn't happen again? That kind of thing. There's a couple other aspects here. Notify, right? You have to notify all of the appropriate parties. And so the SERP should have a list so that people don't have to remember who needs to be contacted, like a checklist. Otherwise, there could be groups that are left out, right? Maybe the public relations team was left out because everyone was just so worried about, dealing with the incident, and they forgot to light up, the communication plan associated with incident response or breach reporting, or forgetting to call the lawyers in. Let's see. Also, you need to assess the impact of the incident on personnel and business operations, and to be able to describe whether it's a degradation of the platform or a complete outage. Contain the incident, of course, and avoid further escalation. The policy also needs to speak to remediation and recovery steps, right? And when you're allowed to begin those. You don't want to start remediation too soon if you haven't figured out who's attacking you and why, because they may have found multiple ways to persist on your platform. And so stepping into the next phases of incident response without clear documented procedures in the SERP is a big risk itself. Determine how to avoid similar occurrences. That's part of the lessons learned. Updating existing or develop new policies based on those lessons learned. So that feeds back into the preparation phase and documentation phase again. And of course, determine the need for legal recourse as necessary. Is there going to be a criminal prosecution based on this event? Was there a theft of data, or was there some other type of law that might have been broken? Of these, notify all appropriate parties. The objective of the SIRP needs to have a little bit more detailed discussion. So notify all appropriate parties. External parties that merit special consideration, and outside counsel has to engage on behalf of your organization in those cases usually, are law enforcement and a third-party forensic specialist. So for example, there was a breach, ransomware event for Colonial Pipeline on Friday. And the ransomware event took out some of their IT infrastructure. And so in a proactive measure, they shut down the entire pipeline, which is like 45% of all fuel and gasoline coming from the Gulf into the eastern seaboard. And they have, stockpiles and tanks of fuel that last, maybe 4 or 5 days. So it'll be interesting to see by Wednesday of next week whether this has been resolved. But they've invoked a third-party forensic specialist, Mandiant, for their incident response, part of the Mandiant FireEye organization. And of course, law enforcement is involved in that case as well, I'm sure, with FBI coming in to help and assist. But what did Colonial Pipeline do wrong? Well, we'll talk about that when we get to the InfoSec in the news section at the end of the class, because I've been looking into that today. Let's focus for now on 2 external parties for the moment, law enforcement and third-party forensic specialists, because they involve a very strict protocol, actually, for communication and notification for legal reasons. Notify law enforcement. Reasonable belief that the incident involves one of these things, right? Criminal activity, fraud, theft of property, or identity theft. If there is clear evidence, or at least strong reasonable belief of criminal activity, fraud, theft, or real threat or risk that personal information has been accessed or acquired without authorization, or the incident is likely to result in identity theft, outside counsel needs to make the contact in order to maintain attorney-client privilege. I've spoken about this a few times, but it can't be emphasized enough. But remember, not even 10 years ago, this would have not been an option on the table for a lot of companies, because the risks outweighed the benefits of involving law enforcement agency. That determination now skews a little bit more towards notification, because oftentimes they need the help of these larger organizations, and they look irresponsible now if they don't engage them. But 10 or more years ago, a company could keep things on the low down and not even declare a breach and not even report to third parties or law enforcement the fact that an incident occurred. But there's much stronger legislation in place now and coming further, I'm sure, from the administration, certainly with anyone that works in government and has government contracts. The breach disclosure requirements are going to become a lot stronger because right now they're supposed to disclose, but they don't always. It raises their premiums, makes them look bad, and they also have to potentially give up data to law enforcement that they might not want to give up. So what are some of the positive factors to consider for law enforcement? Well, you gain agency intelligence and insight, and it bolsters your media and your customer narrative to show that you've engaged law enforcement. Leaving aside the regulated industries and incidents that mandate law enforcement notification, there are factors to consider on a per incident basis. It's not uncommon for a law enforcement agency to have been tracking a cyber threat for some time and to have some developed and significant information about the activities and tactics of specific hacking groups and advanced persistent threats, APTs. By coordinating with law enforcement, an organization may receive valuable non-public information that could help it identify the vulnerabilities exploited in a breach. Think of CISA reaching out, to folks for the Microsoft proxy logon vulnerabilities, and having the Department of Justice actually approve the FBI to go and unhack some of these hosts, which I think is a dangerous precedent. I'm not terribly fond of that one, actually. But anyway, that's them being proactive. We just hope it doesn't get too proactive when they might start installing monitoring tools on people's platforms in the interest of the critical infrastructure. Let's see. And so anyway, they could help it identify various exploits that are in play based on their signals, intelligence, and gathering, and the potential incident behind the incident, or sorry, the potential intent behind the incident might be known to the law enforcement. And of course, they may actually know the source of the attack because they could be seeing it happening in another company that you don't even know about. So being able to say that the organization has notified and is working with law enforcement This is, of course, going to strengthen its message to stakeholders that it's done all that it can to respond. What are some of the negative factors of law enforcement notification? Well, if you do, you may be compelled to participate in an agency investigation. The agency could take an action based on that investigation that's actually contrary to the interests of the business. They may shut down some practice that was observed and had been abused, for example, which was making money for your business and was in a bit of a gray area. So this is a potential risk that can come from engaging law enforcement. An agency may decide, law enforcement agency may decide to open investigation into a breach after learning about it as the result of the affected organization's outreach. If the investigation chooses to do so, the scope and direction of the investigation is essentially outside of the organization's control, right? Although many law enforcement agencies have realistic expectations and understanding that responding to an incident takes significant time and resources on the part of the organization, law enforcement may make requests that take time to respond to and divert resources from other remediation activities. All right, the second category that we wanted to reach a little more depth on, notifying third-party forensics providers and agencies. Based on the severity, nature, and complexity of the incident, you need to determine whether to involve a third-party forensic investigator or expert based on the capacity of your internal information security resources and or the need, like I mentioned, to maintain outside expertise, objectivity, and attorney-client privilege. So in some cases, it may be necessary to include external forensic reports and support. Most people do this actually because they don't want to pretend they're handling it on their own. That just doesn't play well these days, right? You're going to go to SecureWorks or Mandiant or one of the other companies in this space that does this for a living. In some cases, it may be necessary to include, like I said, external forensic support. Engagement of a third-party forensic investigator should be done at the direction of legal counsel, not just as a choice by IT or InfoSec. And provide an analysis and advice based on the findings and conclusions of the investigation. The recommendation or report that comes back from a forensic investigation can be used to determine whether a breach has occurred and whether external notification is required by law or vendor contract language, for example. You may have some contracts with vendors that require you to notify security incidents, even if they're not breaches. So you need to know what those are. Of course, we can't talk about security incident response policy without enumerating a little bit, and this is not exhaustive, but what is personal information, right? Because that triggers the need in many states, to disclose and to send a letter to the affected parties and to the government, usually the Secretary of State or the CIO for the state, for the affected entities and users. So personal information includes, but is not limited to, financial account numbers, credit card numbers, along with any required security access codes, CVE codes, passwords, government IDs, government issued IDs such as driver's license numbers, tax ID numbers, passport numbers. Of course, social security numbers and taxpayer ID numbers fit here. Employee IDs, student ID numbers, medical information, medical health and health insurance information, biometric data, date of birth, of course, is considered personal information, mother's maiden name, digital signature that may be used in DocuSign, things like that, postal address, as well as gender preferences, religious practices, things like that. Personal information is typically defined as first name, last name combined with another piece of information. Although in some cases, these may be enough to trigger notification requirements. These alone may be enough to trigger notification requirements in some jurisdictions. Gosh, you just can't stop yelling. All right, let's hit the topic of social media policy. The narrative around your security incident or data breach will be written by the news cycle. Whether your organization takes part in that narrative and is able to lead it and direct it and give it the shape and color that you desire depends on whether you've prepared ahead of time. The social media policy is the document that captures all of the information about who provides information to the media, when they're allowed to provide it, and which channels will be used to reach various audiences. Some organizations will want to purchase specific social media management tools that allow for the review and approval workflows before any updates can be posted to Twitter or Facebook or Instagram. So not allowing direct access to those systems, but instead gated approval portals essentially for anyone posting. Even people posting with the official responsibility to post, let alone, we'll talk in a minute about people posting on their own about an incident, which is a no-no. Let's see. Instagram, of course, there's also more conventional media outlets and channels such as press releases and television and print authors and articles and writers. So owning the narrative is the goal for many smaller organizations, right, and large. A data breach or high-profile security incident will justify reaching out to a specialized third party to help manage the incident. To help manage the incident communications, right? To run comms, to do spin control, to do damage control. There are specialized agencies that are used for this purpose. Sorry, and the degree to which that you can document and prepare for a security incident that requires notification to external agencies such as law enforcement is also the degree to which you will want to have prepared statements ahead of time that have been blessed by internal counsel, right? Legal says, yes, you can say this blurb, we're copying and pasting it ahead of time into a special document repository for people to use during an incident. And of course, some of them may also need to be blessed by outside counsel and have their perspective on risk of making certain statements, how much data to provide, how much insight to provide. And of course, marketing and HR are going to want to have a review and edit of it as well. Social media policy, we have certain goals, scope, and responsibilities. So the goals of the social media policy is to establish rules and procedures for all users when using social media sites, whether it's during an incident or not, right? And if they're amplifying and echoing something posted by the official media channel, that's fine. Adding your own comments to it and perspective to it, that's often not fine, right? Because you are not an official spokesperson for the company. And so adding your own perspective is usually considered a no-no. And that's why the goals and scope and responsibilities are a part of this document. The scope, it does not apply to the purely personal use of social media platforms when you make no reference to the organization or related activities. So you have to make sure you define what the scope is for people to actually make individual comments and to make that explicit. Not about, of course, the company and its events and doings, but about, the fact that they go skiing, in the winter, or that they like to go fishing in the summer or something. Another aspect of the social media policy should address responsibilities, of course, and to facilitate users' understandings of their responsibilities when engaging in online communication. And also to promote and maintain compliance with all FINRA, SEC, and other applicable rules if you work in one of those financial services industries. All right, so I think there's three basic, moral compass or social media compass type topics to introduce here. Respect, representation, and responsibility. So we all appreciate respect, and we all represent more than just ourselves when we speak. Think about the consequences of your words, thoughts, and actions. Even if you act with the best intentions, you must remember that anything you put out there will likely live on forever and can potentially harm the company or others, either now or in the future, if values and norms change about what's considered funny, or how different communities and terms are used in social circles. So let's drill into the respect aspect. I believe that it's fairly common, but it's always good to write it down. We should respect all persons and communities with whom you interact. You should respect others' opinions, especially when those are in heated discussions. And I believe we should respect copyright, of course, respect privacy, respect financial disclosure requirements, and of course, applicable laws. Representation in social media policy. Disclose your opinions as your own and not the views of your organization. That's sometimes a pinned comment, in a Twitter handle, for example. And of course, never disclose anything that's not publicly available information, right? I think it's called MNPI, right? Material non-public information. You should not be representing or disclosing information that has not yet been made public. So you're personally responsible for the content you publish on blogs, on wikis, and other forms of user-generated social media and media. You must make it clear that you're speaking for yourself and not for the organization. And usually only a few individuals are actually official spokespersons for the company. And you can repost their content usually, right? Just reshare with no additional prose or words, even if it's an emoji, it can actually be risky. In order to contribute to, of course, the social spread and reach of a message or an event, especially if it's a positive one. But the most prudent and conservative approach is to not add any original content or commentary that could be mistaken as an expression of the organization. Even if you wrote like LOL, right, about something that you thought was funny, that could be taken the wrong way. And then the third R, responsibility, factually accurate, right? Your posts and your social media interactions should be factually accurate. It should comply. Oh, and of course, this is the wolf in sheep's clothing. If you didn't notice it, we don't want people to be pretending to be a sheep that are actually a wolf. So moving back to responsibility, factually accurate, complies with applicable laws. And in Europe, there are very strong laws against truth, or not, laws for truth in advertising. What else? Refuse to offer advice, support, or comment except on topics within your area of responsibility. And be the first to respond to your own mistake. If you write something that's wrong, don't amplify that negative, incorrect message, or even positive, incorrect message. Admit your mistakes and don't just think that it's going to fly by. You're best to be the first person to point it out and say, oh, this was totally wrong. I can't delete it, but I want you to know that I don't understand things in the same way anymore, for example. Don't post material that is obscene, defamatory, threatening or harassing, discriminatory, or hateful to another person or entity. Messages from the CEO to all employees are not meant for the media. So don't retweet them or copy and paste them and send them out, right? Even though you want to maybe become, a source, for someone. If the company wanted a newspaper to know how the CEO sees an event or an industry trend, the marketing communications department will call them up and they will tell them. So it's not your responsibility and it's not your option to post those kinds of things and sort of leak them, even though it happens a lot. And here I have the Spike Lee film, Do the Right Thing, as my example of responsibility. All right, so components of a social media policy. Obviously, you have to have purpose of the policy, definitions of terms used, authorized users for the different channels, who owns various channels, who owns various content within those channels. And of course, do you have any monitoring and who's responsible for monitoring social media? So you can have a subscription, with some companies like ZeroFox, for example, which watch and monitor social media to see if anyone's maybe taken over an executive or a franchise account. When I was at Marvel, for example, we had thousands of accounts, right, for every character in the Marvel universe. Captain America, and Thor, and Scarlet Witch, and Black Widow, and lots of other ones. Ms. Marvel. Let's see. And we've had very explicit documentation around who owned which channels and who owned content on those channels, because those are not always the same people. Engaging in social media activities is essential to most businesses in this day and age. However, many issues need to be addressed to create a solid social media communication strategy. One of the most important issues is implementing sound social media policy that provides a blueprint for interaction and establishes clear rules to ensure proper adherence and awareness. Remember that first comment at the beginning of class. You can't expect people to adhere to a policy that's not written down, right? And even if you think it's best practices or common sense, quote unquote, that's not true. It's best to be written down. All right, so let's talk about the purpose of the social media policy, right? As with any good document, it has to create a clear statement of purpose. State why your organization is engaging in social media and the scope for putting in place a policy that governs its use. This will help everybody attain a solid understanding of the business, marketing, and technical reasons behind the social media presence. Here I had an augmented reality app demo slide picture or whatever that shows you looking down the street and being able to see different aspects of Wi-Fi connections, a coffee house. 3 miles away is a museum. I'm pretty sure this is a European slide, if I remember correctly. I think those are like, anyway, very European looking people and cars going on in the slide. And I remember there was a really cool company actually that I don't know if it's around anymore, called Layar, L-A-Y-A-R. And they did a really cool augmented reality app where you could actually open it up and you could add a layer to it, which would be an overlay in augmented reality. And it would show you Instagram photos that are geotagged or at least publicly available. And so you could actually look during a party on a Friday night on the app and look out over the city and just kind of zoom out your circumference. And you could see people snapping Instagram photos at that building over there or down the street this way. And it was quite fascinating, this whole new, real-time overlay of what you're looking at in the real world and what's happening in the digital world that corresponds. Or even knowing, for example, what is the property value of that apartment or that house as you drive by it or walk by it. I thought it was fascinating. You're creating what are called POIs, points of interest, because everyone knows, the maps, right? Everyone has Google Maps or Yahoo Maps or Waze or whatever. But what are the interesting points of interest that you can lay onto those maps and make an interesting experience for someone? Social media definitions, always include definitions, right? I often define these words and terms and concepts every time I bring them up to make sure there's no misunderstanding, right? Define what you and your organization regard as social media and how you leverage the various social media platforms to communicate with external audiences. When you don't provide definitions, which includes things that might seem obvious and unambiguous, you open yourself to possible misunderstandings, which is annoying, but also potentially legal and financial jeopardy could arise from this lack of definitions, which is entirely avoidable with good documentation and, like I said, definition of terms. So what is a tweet? The chirp or a small or young bird, a post made on the social media application Twitter, or apps that post on Twitter's platform. Let's see, authorized users, account owners versus contributors. So determine the professionals in your team that are authorized to contribute to social media sites on behalf of your organization, and then specify what activities these individuals should be engaged in and establish who will be in charge, right? And establish who's going to approve and monitor their activities. The contributor will not know the social media account password in many cases, if it's well architected security, but they will still be authorized to post to the account. So you can use Twitter Teams, for example, for that. And then you can ensure MFA on that social media property is well managed and protected against takeover and hacking due to spear phishing or credential stuffing. So you want people to be able to post content, but you don't want them to know the password for the account, essentially. That's a good way to set up security for Twitter, for example. Channel ownership. We talked about this a little bit. Which team owns what? Product, strategy, marketing, customer support. There's all kinds of people that can own different channels and different content. Different teams might own different accounts on different channels. You could have a customer support channel on Twitter, and you could have a marketing channel on Twitter owned by different people. Define the professionals responsible for creating and selecting content, establishing guidelines, schedules for when things are posted, and various channel rules as well. Depending on the number of accounts that your organization has created, you may need to purchase some social media management tools that create workflows and approval mechanisms. At Marvel, for example, I said, we had hundreds, thousands of character accounts, each with a set of social media channels, and some shared with partners like Sony and Netflix. Sony, the partnership with Spider-Man, Netflix, the partnership with Daredevil, for example. All right, content owners. So authoring content for social media is bound by rules set by content owners. And you need to respect those rules, and your social media policy needs to include references to them. So the information that you will provide via social media platforms is of critical importance. Clearly spell out the type of information that can and cannot be divulged via social media. unmistakably emphasizing what is considered proprietary material, non-public, or confidential information. Remember to expect and respect copyright. If it's not yours, don't use it. It's very simple. It's that person's choice to share his or her work with the world, not yours. Before posting someone else's work, please check with the owner first. There may be restrictions for the venue that you're attending, for example, and a policy which prohibits taking photographs, and of course prohibits taking photographs and posting them online. I know, for example, that there are some venues here in New York that have such policies, and you would think, well, why wouldn't they want the social media, crowdsourced attention? And I think it's because they want to control the image of the property, right, the venue. And so make sure you don't just assume that because I'm at the event, I can take a picture and post it, is what I'm saying. And always ask first is the best policy there. All right, so we're at 1 hour in, and we're on slide 44, so plenty more to go before we're done with this this class. That's good. All right, monitoring of social media. Analyze social media for insights, but also, to understand your community, right, and your followers and your customers, and respond to them in social media. Depending again on the size of your social media account following and the number of accounts, a social media monitoring tool might be required. Remember that social media is not a one-way street. In order to listen, businesses use social media monitoring tools to collect social mentions and to track keywords, hashtags, and URLs that they're interested in. Machine learning and artificial intelligence solutions can help make sense of this unstructured data in order to determine NPS, Net Promoter Score, for example, or intent analysis. AWS has AWS Comprehend, for example, which can do intent analysis of unstructured data and taking comments, from social media channels and tweets. And of course, brand and keyword ownership can be analyzed with these tools as well. Think of Power BI or AWS Insights, Quick Insights, I think it's called, or Quick Sites that allow you to understand what's happening and to know whether or not the language and trend and topic and theme around something is positive and beneficial to the brand or negative. There's also an InfoSec aspect to social media monitoring that ties into staff safety, right? Alerting when threats are made or implied so that they can be investigated. So if someone's threatening to kill your CEO on social media, you won't know that just by randomly browsing. You need a professional third-party service to do that for you. All right, monitoring. There's different types of content. There's owned content, earned content, and partnered content. Social media is actually composed of these three channels. Many companies, they primarily focus on owned channels only, but the partnered and the organic influencers are the more significant discussions to follow and to try to help shape. The earned channel of discussions consists of what's being said about the brand, separate from what the brand and any partners are actually saying. And so you should also keep in touch, in my mind, with your competitors' mentions and social media activities to understand the industry space and not just your own corner of it. This is an example of I think Sprout Social, Facebook global engagement graph showing who's engaged when based on time of day. But you can also do this and day of week. You can also do this based on net promoter, positive or negative type mentions. And of course, monitoring, we want to be aware of the trolls and to be aware of the bots. And you can buy certain bot subscriptions from bot monitoring, bot protection to make sure that people aren't necessarily damaging your brand programmatically, for example, through code and software. In internet slang, a troll is a person who starts quarrels or upsets people on the internet to distract by posting inflammatory and aggressive or extraneous or off-topic messages in an online community, such as a news group, a forum, a chat room, or a blog. Of course, the intent of a troll is to provoke readers into displaying emotional responses and normalizing tangential discussion, whether for the troll's amusement or for a specific gain. Beware the trolls among your social media followers and don't let them distract you for the real work of communication and support with your users and clients. or fans. So some expected questions that should be answered ahead of time in a social media policy about an incident, right? For an incident response. What happened, right? Clear, simple terms, right? When did it happen? What information was compromised? Was my information compromised? How many people's information was impacted? Was the information encrypted before it was potentially exfiltrated or compromised? And was my social security number compromised? These are the things that often come up as a quick checklist of expected questions for a breach incident that must be dealt with in social media. And let's see, what else? These are basically some of the top level questions that I like to make sure are addressed in social media policy. And they'll arise, of course, after the incident is disclosed, and you'll need prepared and proactive responses. Where possible, these responses are usually not shared in writing, though, and not shared except if specifically asked by an impacted individual or the press. So think of this as your, your script, your bullets, your talking points, but don't necessarily publish it all in one place because you're over disclosing at that point. Social media likes to try to answer questions, but only if they've been asked. And so you don't need to go further in oversharing in this case. What other questions are going to come up? Did anyone misuse this information? What should I do, right? What does this mean to me? You put out a release, you send a letter, but it should address what does this mean, right, to me? What should I do? What are you doing to protect me? Usually companies have to buy identity monitoring and protection and theft prevention tools and subscriptions for the impacted users. Why aren't you taking other measures to help? And you need to be prepared to address that question. What are you doing to protect others? Oftentimes people do turn towards others, even if it was just them that were impacted. Maybe, what was it, the Geico breach, for example, talked about people having their driver's license information compromised. Will this happen again? Of course, you want to have sentences and words and promises and tools in place that say, no, we're going to be doing X, Y, Z in order to make sure this doesn't happen again. And then, of course, who should I contact if I have more questions? So always have at least that set of stuff ready to go in the social media policy, but don't necessarily publish it on your website. All right, so I'm going to take a quick water break here and head into the second lecture. All right, so this is now security awareness training. The weakest link in the chain will break, and bad actors target the weakest link in security defenses. And that weakest link is often the wetware, what's happening up here, right? And not the software or the hardware. The weakest link is you. Over 90% of data breaches are found to have been linked to a phishing or spear phishing email as the point of entry for the malware or the ransomware or the system compromise. Technology cannot solve the problems inherent in wetware: fatigue, curiosity, vanity, greed. Bad actors make ample use of what is termed social engineering in order to learn how to trick you into clicking on a link or downloading a file. In this final portion of the lecture, the final portion of this lecture, I'm going to explore the role that security awareness training plays in an overall information security program. I'm going to talk about the importance of building a culture that rewards end user vigilance and skepticism about whether that 2-for-1 coupon that just landed in your inbox is real or not. And it's not just training end users about the dangers of phishing emails. It's also about cultivating secure development best practices and assembling the executive management team for a tabletop exercise periodically, where a scenario or two are proposed as if they're actually taking place, and working through the simulated attack and following the documented incident response procedures to see if everyone knows what to do. From first-tier support engineers to marketing teams handling communications to executives who have had to make critical decisions about whether to engage an outside entity to help handle the incident. And lastly, we'll go into what is known as red team exercises, where a trusted third party is tasked with breaking into your organization and finding ways to bypass your monitoring and security tool defenses. You define one or more targets for the red team to try to achieve, and you'll soon learn that they almost always win. But better that this happened with a friendly attacker who then explains what vulnerabilities were found and leveraged in order to gain control of your infrastructure than with an actual bad actor. Remediating the findings from a red team exercise can take time, but there is no better way to acquire the attention and usually a few InfoSec extra dollars in the budget after a red team exercise occurs. And of course, it helps management address the real risks and exposures of the organization. All right, so training and awareness. Smart monkeys and dumb tools, or smart tools and dumb monkeys? So I was asked this question at an InfoSec meetup a year or two ago. It was not exact in these exact words, but you get the idea. So if you had to choose, why would you choose and why? What would you choose? Which one would you choose and why? So my answer was smart monkeys and dumb tools. Why? Because people are your last line of defense. After all the tools have had their chance to block, quarantine, and otherwise delay an email from reaching a user inbox, you know that a couple of them will get there. Dangerous links or attachments and all. So flex the skeptical muscle and test and train and train and test. And that will be the thing that can save you from a malware outbreak, a data breach, or worse. So invest time and money and attention in your InfoSec program to security training and awareness. It's money well spent. Objections that you might see. Oh, we don't need it. We've not had a cybersecurity incident. Don't need it. May be lucky, but not forever. It's not a matter of if you will be breached, but only a matter of when. And it will cost a lot. It will cost you a lot when you're breached. Of course, people think security awareness training is expensive. And I say, no, it's not. It's not true. You can have some very inexpensive programming and training and testing solutions delivered. A breach is going to cost you millions. Another objection you might hear is the behaviors, they won't change. Adult learning experts agree that lessons delivered repeatedly in a variety of formats have a much better chance of sticking. So while it's true that behaviors are difficult to change, they're not impossible. You just have to go about it the right way. Another objection you might hear, tools are enough. I would say to that, bad actors circumvent these tools pretty quickly and pretty easily, and they expose the business via the weakest link, the users. And lastly, the objection that you want to be able to answer and get beyond. We're too small to justify a security awareness training program. And again, I would say 43% statistics say 43% of breaches involve small businesses. So no one's too small, right? Attacks target vulnerabilities, not specific businesses. You might be attacked and a victim just as collateral damage because they were, doing a wide campaign and they weren't actually going for your company. You may have just been caught up in, a larger criminal organization's efforts to get ransomware distributed. All right, so what departments typically block or support security awareness programs? So this was according to a 2019 SANS security awareness report that surveyed about 1,500 respondents. And audit is often a supporter, of course. Marketing, not so much, because they read emails a lot and they click on them often. So there's sometimes a blocker to doing a security awareness program or doing it a lot, doing it frequently. Finance is slightly a net supporter. Human resources, of course, big time supporter. InfoSec, off the charts support for it, of course. IT, they're going to be all over doing a good security awareness training program as well, because they're often losing their weekends or nights sleep because of stupid user tricks, clicking on things and causing a malware incident or outbreak or something that they have to help clean up. Legal, of course, understands this equation quite well. Operations, they're a little bit mixed because they get dinged because they're oftentimes running so fast that they don't have the time to slow down and be skeptical about an email that says, I don't know, you have a voicemail message, click this link to listen to it. If people know what kind of voicemail platform you're using, and that's not too hard to discern sometimes, they could easily spoof people into clicking on things. There's other ways to trick people as well. Project management office, they're historically actually supporters of this work as well. And of course, senior leadership, it varies by company, but in this survey, it was a strong supporter of it. And then of course, any others that responded that were from other groups. All right, like maybe an employee union, right, who doesn't want security awareness training because it could get people into trouble and get them fired potentially. So cost of a data breach. This is a little bit old information, but I think it's probably only gone up since then. So the average cost of a data breach in 2020 was predicted to exceed $150 million. And I'd have to Google again to see if that number has been bested by reality last year. According to a Juniper research report, as more businesses' infrastructure get connected, Juniper suggested that cyber crimes costs over $2 trillion in 2019. And business losses due to cybercrime data breaches were, prior to COVID at least, predicted to exceed $5 trillion by 2024. So we'll see where we end up on that in the predictive scale by Juniper Research. So effective training, right? Effective training is a necessity. It helps team members develop the skills they need for their role. Effective security awareness programs need to be fun and supported by executive management. Programs should focus on changing the behavior of employees, and they should be interactive and diverse in manner. A diverse security awareness training program will include the entirety of the company with things such as newsletters, posters, email tips, other communications on a regular basis. And the content needs to engage different learning styles, right? Like we talked about in the class on documentation. Different learning styles in order to increase retention and engagement. NCSAM, National Cybersecurity Awareness Month, October, right? Every year, NCSAM is a collaborative effort between government and industry to raise awareness about the importance of cybersecurity and to ensure that all Americans have the resources they need to be safer and more secure online. You could, of course, take the sentence Americans out of that sentence. NCSAM was launched by the National Cybersecurity Alliance and the U.S. Department of Homeland Security in October of 2004. At the very least, your organization can download the toolkit and take a day or two to promote security awareness on a variety of topics, selecting the ones that are most relevant for your industry and business. But once a year is not effective. Once a year, check the box, static and unimaginative training has almost no effect on increasing your employees' security awareness. So quarterly lunch and learn sessions on digital hygiene, social media risks, password management, all topics like this can be addressed in a good year-round security awareness program. All right, phishing awareness training. This one's fun. I do a lot of this. It's fun for us creating the campaigns and tests and making it not punishment-based, right? Making it a carrot, making it entertaining. So while not everyone agrees with the idea that positive reinforcement is superior to negative enforcement, I know some companies where they do want to do they do want to implement a 3 strikes and you're out policy. I just don't think it'll work. It should be pointed out that phishing awareness training is meant to educate and not to punish. Tricking your colleagues every month with a perfectly crafted phishing test is not the point of phishing awareness training. So I always make sure that each test has 1 or 2 what I call breadcrumbs left in the message that should be seen as flags, signs that should trigger suspicion or skepticism, clues that they're there to help them train the eye and to exercise the application of judgment and critical thinking. Why did I get this message? Was this really meant for me? Should I call the sender to quickly verify that they indeed mailed this message to me? Why am I being asked to wire transfer money when it's not my usual job? So those breadcrumbs are my sort of bits, right? Small little typos that I leave in the message or create in the message in order to help people identify that it is a test and it is malicious. And if they do click on it, then they are on a landing page that tells them that it was an authorized test. Phishing awareness. Phishing is email sent to many. Spear phishing is email sent to one or a few people. Phishing is a type of fraud in which a bad actor attempts to harvest credentials or deploy malware by impersonating a legitimate brand and sending users to a malicious website or opening a malicious email attachment. There's also vishing, which is voicemail phishing, and smishing, which is SMS-based phishing. And some platforms allow you to do complete testing campaigns that use both, which is kind of mean, but cool and useful, actually, right? So you get an email and then you get an SMS saying, hey, did you get my email? Or you get a voicemail message and a voice recording saying, hey, I just sent you an email. I need you to click on this invoice and tell me whether or not that's the right amount to be paid, or for example, something like that. Phishing plays upon 4 things: fatigue, curiosity, vanity, and greed. So how do we get lured by a phishing email? Well, these traits play a big role in the relative success of a phishing campaign or phishing test. So knowing when to send the message is a key element to phishing with regard to fatigue. Start of day and end of day represent 2 windows for hapless clicks. Curiosity is probably one of the most powerful motivators for any call to action in an email with a promising or an inviting link or attachment. Vanity is a tried and true approach as well, of course, but you won't get a wide catch using vanity in your testing of susceptibility to phishing. But you will always get a few big-headed personality types if the social media research is done well and tailored to the moment and to a particular individual. And lastly, let's not forget that there's always financial incentives that can be relied upon to catch a few clicks. Every scenario that you can run with a monetary angle, right, to the motivation to click or download something. It does not, mind you, have to be a big amount. Indeed, a $25 Amazon gift card is much more plausible and inviting than a $500 gift card for most people. Phishing awareness test rates by industry in 2019. So I think Proofpoint purchased Wombat Security in 2018, but this was based on industry, and this has changed. Basically, all of this has moved up about, 5 or 6 percentage points now due to work from home in my understandings and readings on the topic. So fatigue, deteriorating quality of decisions are made by an individual due to fatigue, either being awake early in the morning before their coffees come in, or staying up late at night and working too hard. In decision-making and psychology, decision fatigue refers to the deteriorating quality of decisions made by an individual after a long session of decision-making, right? So this is talking about the end-of-day fatigue. And it's now understood as one of the causes of irrational trade-offs in decision-making. So most phishing tests capture the majority of the folks who click on the email link within the first hour of it being delivered. So if you target first thing in the morning or end of day, you can mirror the real-world phishing attacks that try to leverage fatigue. Oftentimes, the people phishing don't know what time zone your users are in, but you should. And so some of the platforms allow you to schedule delivery of the email for local time. So if you have a multi-time zone or multi-country footprint, you can say, deliver this at 9 a.m. local time, right? Or 9:25 a.m. or something. Or at 4:35 p.m. local time, rather than sending it out to the whole company at once, because some people are just not going to click if it comes when their brains are working just fine. Curiosity. The number one reason users are likely to interact with the contents of any message, whether it's in Slack or SMS or voicemail or email. Curiosity is also the reason someone will insert a USB stick that's left lying around the office as a part of a red team exercise. For many users, the idea that they might come to know something that they were not privy to on their own is an irresistible urge. An email that seems to have been sent to them erroneously, that perhaps compensation information or bonus stipend is going to always garner a good percentage of clicks. This is part of human nature, and of course, to be curious. And the phishing test should include this kind of approach every now and then to help train our response and control of the urge to click on that email. I think it was SANS.org, the organizational education and training community. They got phished, it was maybe last year or 2 years ago. Somebody sent a credential harvesting campaign to them, which had a perfectly emulated Office 365 Azure login prompt. And the thing that prompted everyone to click on that mail and enter their credentials was the title of the file. And the file was, July bonuses. And so when they sent that out, at least one person, if not more than one, ended up clicking on it, giving credentials, and then SANS got breached. So even the security experts in this field, right, who are ostensibly more savvy and resilient to this stuff, can fall for it as well. And of course, vanity, excessive pride in or admiration of one's own appearance or achievements, So there's several ways to engage users with an appeal to their vanity in security and phishing awareness tests. Recently, some enterprising phishing attacks have used Instagram verified identity. The email asks victims to apply for exclusive verified account status, capturing their credentials on the way. The scam centers around Instagram's labeling of verified accounts, which indicates that the account user is a public figure, a celebrity, a global brand with a blue check mark. The exclusive status is highly desirable for Instagram users. So vanity award emails can also be sent out, right? Telling a business owner that her business has been selected for the 2020 Best of, and then insert city name awards. As with similar emails sent to unsuspecting businesses and nonprofit agencies throughout the country, the winner must pay $149 or $229 to claim the honor and to receive a personalized plaque. That's obviously financial gain, but you could also gain credentials or have people click on malware. And then last but not least, greed. The intense and selfish desire for something, especially wealth, power, or food. Successful phishing attacks and tests exploit human weaknesses, essentially, and greed is certainly one of them. People have been known to make some really dumb decisions when they let greed get the better of them. Cyber criminals are not just targeting potential victims with offers of cash prizes. 2-for-1 dinner coupons are harmless enough sounding, right? Recently, the gaming industry has been used to invite users with the promise of new character skins in Fortnite or free V-Bucks. Transfer of the virtual asset requires providing your credentials, of course, and that's the real goal of the campaign. So scams of that sort, I know I had to train my son against it and say, no, there is no one that's going to give you free V-Bucks for watching this little clip or for answering questions, or maybe they will actually give you some, but it's usually a scam. To get information about, what is your mortgage, where do you live, do you have 2 cars, this is like financial reconnaissance, right, for who to scam and how. All right, so social engineering emotions. There are 3 that are being preyed upon when a social engineering attack is being waged. So in addition to playing upon fatigue, curiosity, and vanity and greed, strong emotions are involved in calls to action and phishing tests and other scams. So bad actors use social media intelligence gathering to identify what kind of activity can be inspired by appealing to fear, obedience, and helpfulness. Fear. Obviously, fear is considered an unpleasant emotion. It's caused by the belief that someone or something is dangerous and likely to cause pain or a threat. As one of our most powerful motivators, fear is arguably the most commonly manipulated emotion when it comes to social engineering campaigns. Whether in the form of a phony email that your online bank account has been compromised and requires a password change, or an urgent bank security notice, these scams leverage a specific threat to the targeted recipient or group of recipients, which forces them to act quickly to avoid or rectify a dangerous or painful situation. Recently, the use of data breach data sets on the dark web is used in the email, sometimes in the subject of the email or as the name of a file attachment. They'll take a password that was one of your prior passwords in one of these breach data sets, and they will put that in the subject of the email, and that freaks you out, or in the attachment, right? And it's like, I don't know, if your password was oobity flibbity, .pdf might be the attachment name, right? This lends a degree of believability to the threat that the file contains something embarrassing or sensitive in nature about the recipient, such as nude photos or captured images from their laptop camera, for example. This is very common, actually. And of course, it appeals to fear. There can also be, during COVID, lots of people appeared to medical fears and said, your uncle is, on a respirator, you have to come now immediately because we don't have health insurance information on file for him. So please, pay this money to cover the costs, otherwise he's going to be taken off the ventilator or something like that. There was lots and lots of bad, COVID-related phishing tests. Not tests, phishing campaigns that were used like this. Obedience is another of the emotions I want to mention. So complying with an order, complying with a request, complying with the law, submitting to another's authority. Social engineering scams that prey on obedience are often disguised as an email, an instant message, or even a phone call or voicemail from a person or group of superior authority, such as law enforcement or an executive at your own company. Because we're taught from a young age to trust authorities, we're not easily conditioned to question the validity of their correspondence, and we tend to comply with their instructions, their requests, and their guidance. Mattel, the toy manufacturer, nearly delivered $3 million to a cyber criminal who disguised himself as the company's CEO in an email to a finance executive with instructions to approve a payment. Bigger losses than this have occurred for sure, given social media platforms, security compromises, and preying upon our inherent obedience behavior. And then lastly, helpfulness is the other emotion that is used in calls to action. Helpfulness is essentially the quality of giving or being ready to give help to another. So not all phishing tests and attacks take advantage of negative human tendencies. Another commonly exploited emotion is a willingness to help out another person or group. These campaigns are often targeted at customer support or customer service departments, right? Whether it's their job to help and solve problems. As attackers are betting that these employees' propensity to lend a hand and help people happily will encourage them to divulge or accept more information than they should. Bad actors see tragedy as an opportunity, unfortunately. Shown here is the American Sign Language word art for help. And there were plenty of catastrophe scams with tsunamis and earthquakes and fires that were preyed upon as well. All right, so what are the phishing clues? Grammatical errors and typos. These may go away eventually, but at the moment, most phishing messages do contain grammatical errors and typos. Of course, they usually or often include odd domain names, right? Slightly off from the one that you might know. Maybe a character replaced a 0 for an O or something like that. And of course, phishing clues, a sense of urgency, right? This idea that something needs to happen now, and you need to really, really jump on it, right? That's definitely a sense of urgency that's conveyed in a lot of phishing attacks. And of course, credential request. Many times there's no good reason for the credential request. The banks will never send you an email saying, we need you to change your password and give you a link in that password. They have other means for doing that, like when you log in, but not sending you an email. These are some of the main clues that users should become aware of with regard to phishing emails and phishing awareness testing and training. So I like to try to include some of them in my various scenarios to test that aspect of that emotion and those clues. Security awareness programs should make it easy to report, right? Make it as easy as possible for users to report bad or suspicious emails. So just forwarding a bad email to the InfoSec team is actually not enough. It's not sufficient. The headers of the original email are not captured when you do that, and thus they're not visible for investigation. So essentially, you need to find a way, whether you're using Cofense, phishme.com or KnowBefore, they're going to have a bad email button that you can create and publish to your Google web forms or to your Outlook or to other mail platforms. And so it lives in the email application. And when it's a web-based email solution, this is a really pretty easy, great bit of work to organize. And it makes the life of users easier because they just hit one button. It downloads the email for them, sends it as an attachment, and then removes it from their mailbox, right? And it achieves the information security improvements. So basically a win-win situation to push out a phishing alert button or a bad email button. And these happy situations where it's win-win, easy for the user and improved security should definitely be sought out and celebrated. Phishing test types. There are click campaigns, there are file attachment campaigns, and there are credential harvesting campaigns. You should be testing all of these yourself as well. Phishing tests have 3 different types. With the click campaign, the fail is when the user opens the email and clicks on the link or links provided that would have taken the user to a website with malicious content or an active security exploit embedded in the site content or code. For file attachment campaigns, You have a longer event stream on the way to fail that includes opening the email, downloading the attachment, and then opening the attachment with the macro or other malware exploit code included. And lastly, both click campaigns and file attachment campaigns can make use of credential harvesting as a part of the test. So clicking on the link, which then presents a valid looking Google authentication dialog or Office on Exchange Online or Azure dialog authentication box, is essentially a two-step test. So knowing how many of your users who click on a link and then are either further convinced to provide their corporate password on the landing page for the test, it's a very useful metric to influence your testing program and to keep track of improvements, hopefully, over time that occur as you execute more tests and people become more skeptical. I know sometimes people are sending me emails and I'm assigning them to their phishing training. And they're like, is this another test? And I'm like, no, this is actually your phishing training test email. You have to go click on this link and watch the training video for 10 minutes and do a quiz or something, just to help them, hopefully help them get better at identifying it. And I'll mix it up. Don't make it the same training every time. Oftentimes I'll try to make it a choice if I can of like 3 or 4 different videos. And so if they're a recidivist, someone who fails more than once, then they can choose one and not have to watch the same content every time, because that's a little bit better experience for them. So what are some of the signs for improvement? Basically rerun some of the scenarios. A particular click campaign, right? It's helpful to show whether there are improvements over time, because it may not be from month to month, but you could go from maybe year to year. So take, for example, a Halloween pumpkin e-card, right? Click test. You run that in October. That can be compared very cleanly with a Valentine's e-card click test in February, right? Or an Easter e-card click test in April. So when you rerun a scenario of a particular type, you're better able to gauge whether the phishing tests are actually showing signs of improvement. Comparing the click-through rate of an e-card test with a credential harvest test, that's not valid, right? Those two metrics. So your incidence of recidivism is also better measured across a pair of similar scenarios in order to factor in some of the environmental parameters, such as time of day and proximity to related events, such as tax filing deadlines and things like that. Signs of failure. If possible, the landing page for a successful lure of a user should provide immediate feedback and a learning moment, right? A learning opportunity. The landing page of a phishing test should contain a small but digestible moment of teaching and education. It shouldn't just be like, who is this? I forget. This is Ralph Wiggum's son or something, maybe. I forget his name. I haven't seen The Simpsons in a while, but saying, ha ha. All right, so recidivism. The act of a person repeating an undesirable behavior after they've experienced negative consequences for that behavior or have been trained to avoid the behavior, like failing 2 phishing or 3 or 4 phishing tests in a year. So what to do with users who fail every single phishing test? What kind of consequences can you apply to recurring risky behavior by someone in your organization? Short interviews with the people who click on phishing test emails is one way to explore the root cause of the poor or weak judgment. In the end, if they don't seem to have what it takes to apply skepticism to the phishing emails, or they're unable to see the breadcrumbs that you're leaving for them to find, then you might want to take things up with their manager or with HR. And if you have the ability to implement custom security policies and controls for internet access, like a DNS firewall policy, for example, you can try to mitigate the risk of those susceptible recidivist users by having a more aggressive firewall policy or a more aggressive antivirus scanning frequency for their laptop or their workstation. You can give their account a more frequent password rotation policy, or you can require 2-factor auth events if a dynamic or adaptive authentication solution is available. So basically, click-happy, non-judgmental, non-skeptical users can be put into a little less trusting security profile and policy. All right, let's see. We're zooming right along. The SDLC software development lifecycle, right? There's some best practices that we should speak about here as well for security awareness. So the software development life cycle should include security by design. It should include privacy by design. It should include resiliency by design, and of course, measurement by design, analytics and KPIs and observability. Security should not be a speed bump on the road from development to production. Security should be a continuous part of the SDLC. But because security is often a non-functional requirement, it's often easy for developers to ignore the warning signs that their code is going to have a business logic flaw, or a vulnerable component software library, or to permit privilege escalation. So it's a stronger InfoSec program that teaches the OWASP top 10 to the developers and the Scrum Masters than to just implement a tool that performs OWASP top 10 scanning, right? Education and tooling. And of course, all of these findings can be discovered. You want them to find them in security findings earlier in the SDLC so that the cost of correcting or fixing them is kept as low as possible. The cost is lower to remediate a security bug in a sandbox environment than to test and fix the same bug later on in a UAT or QA environment in terms of hard costs and soft costs of development and cycles of developers. Secure development. Start with requirements. A lot of times people actually think, oh, I know what to build, I'll just go build it. No, you should have requirements and you should document them, including the non-functional requirements. Also develop based on standards, right? Have a standard build image. Don't let people just start with a generic infrastructure, you know, a container or a VM or an EC2 instance that's a plain vanilla unhardened image, right? Based on standards, use standards and frameworks in your code libraries. And of course, test early and test often. So in this use of the term, requirements are non-functional requirements, right? That's what I mean when I say start with requirements. It includes putting constraints on process behaviors and input handling code, right? Resistance to and tolerance of intentional failures. People trying to type backtick, you know, drop tables into an input form. And then of course, prevent unexpected interactions between threads and processes. Use of coding standards has several benefits for security, including code that is consistent, code that's readable, and code that's easy to understand. Code reviews go easier, downstream maintenance is more efficient. And of course, lastly, finding security weaknesses early in development reduces costs and speeds up release cycles. So testing early is key to secure development. Security testing can identify memory leaks, access violations, arithmetic errors, array and string overruns, and buffer underruns and overruns. So this is just healthy development, but it also brings with it the added benefit of making things more secure and fault tolerant and performant. So let's talk about code review, sometimes referred to as peer review, to check a program when at least one of the people is not the code's author. Garrett is a tool that I've used in the past, for example. Garrett is a free web-based team code collaboration tool. Software developers in a team can review each other's modifications on their source code using a web browser and approve or reject those changes. It iterates and integrates closely with Git, a distributed version control system. Garrett is a fork of something called Rietveld, another code review tool, and both namesakes are both namesakes are of Dutch designer Gerrit Rietveld. So if you go to GerritCodeReview.com, let me copy this link address and throw it into the chat real quick so that you have it available, and it's part of the notes and lecture downloads later. All right, next up, secure coding guidelines. Input validation, right? Can't just accept any old input that someone might provide on the internet. Output encoding, authentication and password management, session management, access control, cryptographic practices, error handling and logging. So while OWASP, which stands for the Open Web Application Security Project, while OWASP specifically references web apps, the secure coding practices and principles outlined above should be applied to non-web applications as well. Secure coding guidelines. Here, I just wanted to mention a few things, data protection, communication security, encrypting things, for example, system configuration and hardening, database security, obviously, because that's where some of the most valuable data lives, authentication, password rotation on service accounts for databases, file management practices, memory management, general coding practices. All of these things are good secure coding guidelines that can be reinforced with training and awareness. Some of the risk factors that we have to pay attention to. Independent systems make software the weakest link. Software size and complexity complicates testing. An outsourced software supply chain increases your risk of exposure. There's been several cases of that recently, right, where people have been injecting bad code into repositories in order to do a supply chain attack. Sophisticated attacks, they can find obviously more risk and expose that risk and exploit it. And of course, legacy software is often reused. That's one of the factors that we have to pay attention to. People just continuing to reuse a library that hasn't been updated and doesn't have the latest stable and secure packages included in it. Let's see what else. Despite many advances that have been made in cybersecurity coverage, much of the effort has been focused on adding security after the fact and improving threat detection. I think what we need to remember is that we're not in the business of deploying security features. We should be in the business of deploying features securely. So that was a bit of witticism that I got from a conference session at RSA 2019 in San Francisco. And I love having phrases like that, right? They just sort of capture a bit of wisdom in really succinct, clever language. So I'll say it one more time. We should not be in the business of deploying security features. We should be in the business of deploying features securely. All right, next up, tabletop exercises and red team exercises. So tabletop exercises are a form of security awareness training. Tabletop exercises are meant to help organizations consider different risk scenarios and to prepare for potential cyber threats. Red team exercises test the overall strength of an organization's defense, the technology, the process, and the people by simulating the objectives and actions of an attacker. Although there are variations for engagements, most red team exercises are performed without the knowledge of the blue team, the defenders. So for example, it would only be me and one other person maybe that would be aware of when the red team exercise was starting. And they would communicate to me, and we would then let the rest of the organization kind of pick up on it and become aware of it or not, based on monitoring and tools and strange behaviors that result from the red team activities. Table team and red team exercises. So training for a security incident ahead of time, unquestionably good thing, both for security of the organization as well as for the audit cycle of the organization, right? You need to be audited that you're performing some type of security testing, and doing a red team or a tabletop or both once a year or even twice or 3-4 times a year is just a good sign of a mature InfoSec program. The tabletop exercise is a security incident preparedness activity. It takes participants through the process of dealing with a simulated incident scenario and providing hands-on training for participants that can then highlight flaws in incident response planning or documentation. And so oftentimes you'll have a third party that you'll engage to run your tabletop, certainly for the red team exercise, although large enough organizations do sometimes have in-house red teams. And you can sign up to have them, attack your app or your business unit if you want. But in the case of tabletops, these are professional, scenario leaders that come in and help you figure out what's a good scenario for your organization, figure out what names, and themes to use, where you might want to, take some of the players out and say as one of the injects, right? It's kind of like Dungeons and Dragons. You get someone telling you, okay, you see a golden, winged dragon in front of you, in front of the gold, pile, and you have to kill the dragon. In this case, when you're picking a scenario for a tabletop, you want something that's relevant and likely to happen, and you want to potentially take out one of the key players. Let's say that there's a particularly smart executive team member that's always thinking and saying, oh, we should definitely do this. And now we need to, call outside counsel. And now we need to talk to the media. One of the injects for the exercise could be this person is suddenly unavailable, right? They're taken ill. And so you can actually take them out of and force this issue of fault tolerance within the executive team to say, well, what would you do if you didn't have, the head of operations, right? Or the or the SVP of engineering. So take them out for a couple of turns and say they had to deal with potentially a threat to their family that had been created by the bad actors, because the bad actors actually do this, right? They'll try to take key players off the table, one of which may be the CISO. All right, next up, 6 tabletops. I want to walk through a couple of them for you so you have them in your notes and experience and can bring them into organizations where you may work in the future. So we're going to talk about the quick fix. We're going to talk about the malware infection scenario. We're going to talk about an unplanned attack, and we're going to talk about cloud compromise. And after that, financial break-in, physical break-in, and then we'll talk about flood zone, natural disaster. Although now, everyone's kind of tired talking about, global pandemic, everyone work from home, discuss, right? We've all been living in a tabletop exercise for the last year, and it might not be flood zone. Anyway, we'll talk about flood zone because that one's a little easier to deal with, right? It doesn't stick around indefinitely. All right, so let's see. Before we get into these tabletop exercises, let's talk about the preparations and setup. So for the tabletop setup, you need to designate a single facilitator, and then you want to break into meaningful learning points. You also want to read the scenario aloud to the group and facilitate a conversation about how the scenario should be handled. And of course, include applicable members of other business units. So most organizations are not ready to run a tabletop exercise themselves the first time around. Procuring the talents of a security vendor who can perform the tabletop exercise will, however, provide a really good example of how it's done. And maybe an internal team can then try a follow-up exercise to perform mini tabletops for smaller teams afterwards. A good first scenario, of course, to run is ransomware. The prospect of it being experienced is real and is very high. And the response time and mitigation techniques are important to identify and prepare ahead of time. Shown here are theater blocking notation symbols. I thought that would be fun to show that there's the sort of high-level language for showing the blocking and movements during a play and during a theater piece. And the same kind of thing could go into describing what's happening in a tabletop exercise. All right, so scenario number 1, the quick fix. Joe, your network administrator, is overworked and underpaid. His bags are packed and ready for a family vacation to Disney World when he's tasked with deploying a critical patch. In order to make his flight, Joe quickly builds an installation file for the patch, deploys it before leaving on his trip. And of course, next, Sue, the on-call service desk technician, starts receiving calls that nobody can log in. It turns out that no testing was done for the recently installed security, the critical patch. So what are some of the discussion questions for this scenario? And you could do this for an hour or something, right? Well, what is Sue's response in this scenario? Does your on-call technician have the expertise to handle the incident? Does she know how to go in and roll back the change, right? If not, are there defined escalation processes so that she can reach out and figure out who's going to do the rollback? Does your organization have a formal change control policy? Someone might have been in a position to say, no, Joe, you're not going to make this change, at 4:30 on a Friday, leaving for the airport to go to Disney World. We're going to wait, right? We'll have to wait on the patch. And of course, you're going to want to have a lesson learned if you got breached while he was gone because you didn't patch, because you didn't have 2 people that knew how to do the one thing that needed to be done, which was apply the network update. Does your organization have a disciplinary procedures in place for when an employee fails to follow established policies, like change control, documentation request, approval? If they just jack the change in and say, oh, it'll go fine, and then run off to Disney World, you could easily find a recourse with HR, to discipline the person for putting the organization at risk. And of course, do you actually have the ability to roll back patches in the event of an unanticipated negative impacts or a schema change to a database, right? Nothing like losing a couple of days of work because no one made a backup prior to doing a change and they thought it was trivial and they just didn't have the time to prepare a rollback plan or documentation for someone to do it if they can't be around to do it themselves. All right, scenario number 2, malware infection. The scenario: an employee within your organization used the company's digital camera for a business purpose. In the course of doing so, they took a scenic photograph that they then loaded onto their personal computer by inserting the SD card. The SD card was infected with malware while connected to the employee's personal computer. Then, when it was reinserted into a company machine, it infected the organization system with the same malware. Easy to explain, easy to believe scenario here. So what is our discussion? The tabletop discussion would say, who within your organization would you need to notify? Make sure people know once they see that pop up on their screen saying there's a ransomware attack or a malware taking place, or unsuccessful quarantine of the malware. How would your organization identify and respond to malware infecting your system through this vector? What's the process for identifying the infection vector? How does it get identified by the help desk team and escalated to InfoSec? What other devices could present similar threats? This is more of the lessons learned and follow-up after doing this scenario. What should management do? Do they have something that needs to be done? How can you prevent this from occurring again, this type of scenario? Like blocking USB ports and having exception policies for people that need to use USB sticks for digital photos and transfers, or finding wireless ways to transfer those photos from a camera and not having to have physical access to the camera or a card reader. Does your organization have training policies in place to prevent someone from doing this, right? Using the same media on a work machine as on a personal machine. And of course, do policies apply to all storage devices? Blocking the ability to use the USB ports is very common, for example. All right, next up, the unplanned attack. So a hacktivist group threatens to target your organization following an incident involving an allegation of use of excessive force by law enforcement. You do not know the nature of the attack they are planning. How can you improve your posture to best protect your organization? So let's say you've heard wind, through a subscription in social media that Anonymous or some other group is going to be targeting your company. Let's say you work for Visa or MasterCard, who have been the subjects of attacks of Anonymous and amplified attacks and DDoS attacks and things like that. Do you have DDoS protections, things like that? So in the unplanned attack scenario, some of the injects and some of the discussion should be around what are the potential threat vectors. So you pull together a war room, you've received signal that you're about to be attacked. What are you going to do? How are you going to go to shields up? How are you going to protect yourself even further because there's an active threat at the moment? Have you considered which attack vectors are going to be the most common that can be used by this group, like defacing your website and taking it over because it doesn't have two-factor auth enabled on it? Are there other methods that you can use to prioritize various threats? Have you checked your patch management status and said, okay, let's make sure we do an extra patch round. Let's not wait until Tuesday or next week or whatever. Let's do it today. Can you increase the fidelity and monitoring of your IDS, your intrusion detection system, or your IPS, your intrusion prevention system? If you don't have the resources to do so, is there potentially another organization that you could call upon to assist, right? Never forget to ask for help or find ways to solve problems that aren't internal at the moment. You could reach out to an ISAC, for example, and see if they have some intelligence and tools and mitigations and techniques for handling this particular threat actor. ISACs, I think we talked about them. Yeah, we did information sharing and alliance committees. What else? Oh, I had lovely ISAC meetings this week, actually, with the IT ISAC, which is one of the larger ones. I had 2 meetings, and they were both excellent. Great intelligence sharing, good discussion about the nature of some of these risks that we're seeing in the news. And furthermore, let's see, how do you alert your help desk to this particular unplanned attack? Do you have, a standard message that can go out that make them not just freak out, but tell them what to look for? Tell them to make sure they have the latest antivirus definitions, that they've updated their web browser, that they have the latest operating system updated. If that's not centrally controlled and managed, by your mobile device management platform, you may have to ask everyone to chip in and best effort, do it by close of business today or something. Do you have any way of notifying the entire organization of a certain threat, like a bulletin board or a bulk SMS technique, because maybe the email system goes down, right, due to a denial of service attack, business email compromise, who knows? Certainly those Microsoft Exchange attacks brought some of those systems down. So what is your out-of-band messaging capacity if you don't have email servers? And of course, does your incident response plan account for these types of situations? Make sure it does. Put some of these tabletop exercise ideas into your incident response plan, not necessarily in granular detail, but high level, right? To make sure you walk through some of the points so that people can study it and be prepared for it. All right, getting close to the end. The cloud compromise scenario. All right, so in this case, one of your organization's internal departments frequently uses an outside cloud storage to store large amounts of data, some of which is considered sensitive. You've recently learned that the cloud storage provider that's being used has been publicly compromised and large amounts of data has been exposed. All user passwords and data stored in the cloud provider's infrastructure may have been compromised. That's a pretty awful situation, but it can happen. And certainly third-party breaches of data happen. It doesn't have to be a cloud compromise. You could easily say that it was one of your vendor partners in this scenario and that they've been compromised. And it's not your fault, but you're going to have to deal with it, right? And so doing a tabletop on dealing with it is a good way to deal with it well, because you've walked through the steps, you've made sure everyone knows their roles and responsibilities, and the tabletop exercise is meant to flex that muscle, right? Respond to an incident so that when a real incident happens, you're not flailing, right? You're not just sort of winging it and playing it by ear. What are the discussion points for the cloud compromise scenario? Does your organization have current policies that consider third-party cloud storage? Should your organization still be held accountable for the data breach? What are your legal obligations? What are your reporting requirements, right? Law enforcement, outside counsel, buying the identity protection for all the impacted users and messaging them on social media. What actions and procedures would be different if this was a data breach of your own local area network or your own storage platform? And of course, what should management do? Does everyone know their jobs? Or did they say, well, I think it should come from the CEO? And someone says, no, I think it should come from the CISO. And someone else says, no, I think it should be the CTO that should be quoted in the news article that's going to be written that you want to get ahead of on the narrative, and not let the internet write the narrative for you with your voice being completely silent. What, if anything, do you tell your constituents and when, right? And how do you notify them? Certainly, this is all useful stuff to think about ahead of time. Get it documented. If someone doesn't have a policy or says, I wouldn't know what to do, I don't know who to call, I don't even know the name of our outside counsel, make sure it's documented somewhere. Make sure many people know how to get to it, right? Be fault tolerant in that search for that critical information. And I think this one, no, this is not the last one. The financial break-in. So this one's good to do. This one happened in the tax office in Amsterdam, actually, just recently. And I emailed some friends and family there and said that there was someone that had stole a hard drive and had a whole bunch of personal information on it, including tax documents, of course, and things like that. So a routine financial audit in this scenario reveals that several people are receiving paychecks, are not, and have never been on payroll. A system review indicates they were added to the payroll approximately 1 month prior at the same time via a computer in the financial department. So what are the discussion points for the financial break-in? You confirm the computer in the payroll department was used to make the additions. And approximately 2 weeks prior to the addition of the new personnel, there was a physical break-in into the office of the finance department in which several laptops without sensitive data were taken. Another inject for this particular discussion point could be further review indicates that all employees are paying a new fee of $20 from each paycheck, and that money is being siphoned to an offshore bank account. Ooh, what fun. These are certainly useful, like I said, 2 hours, 4 hours. You could do 2 scenarios in half a day, potentially, to get people to work through it and think about it and play out, people's roles and responsibilities. And work with, reading the incident response plan and making sure they know what to do and how to proceed. All right. So for the financial break-in, these are some of the discussion points, right? Those were injects. What actions could you take after the initial break-in? Do you have the ability to audit your physical security system, to look at video of the finance department, closed circuit television? How many days ago was it? How many days of storage and look back is available on that platform? Awesome, awesome questions to get out of the way now before a real incident, because you may only have 7 days of data on the video, and it happened 8 days ago or 10 days ago. Or you may not have a system capable of storing and retrieving, the full video footage without sending a hard drive to some, vendor that runs this platform for you. Get all that stuff out of the way now. Or you may not even know who to call, right, to get the copies of the footage, because whoever was setting up the, surveillance and closed circuit television video monitoring of your infrastructure is gone, or it's a third party, and you're in a multi-tenant building, and you have no idea who even to ask for copies of the lobby footage, for example, on a particular day that the break-in may have happened. Would you be able to assess the damages associated from the break-in? Would you know what was on that laptop that was stolen, right? That's the first question the executives are going to ask. Well, what data was stolen? Maybe we don't care what was stolen. Would you be able to find out what credentials have used and what credentials were on the stolen laptop that could be broken through Mimikatz and hashed and taken, and lock all those accounts? Or do you just simply have to rotate all passwords for all users in the whole organization because one laptop was stolen? How do you notify your employees of the incident? What is your communication plan internally and externally? How do you contain the incident? And how do you compensate the employees, of course, after the fact, if this money has been stolen in the optional inject where someone was taking $20 out of every paycheck? There can be bad actors in the finance department, right, or accounting. And the flood zone. So this is the final tabletop exercise that I wanted to run through. So in this scenario, your organization is located, its headquarters is in a flood zone. Winter weather combined with warming temperatures has caused flooding throughout the area. Local authorities have declared a state of emergency. In the midst of managing the flooding, a ransomware attack occurs on your facility, making computer systems inoperable. So this one's a nice double whammy, and that is going to happen. There will be physical security risks and disruptions to business at the same time as digital, right? So what are the discussion questions here? Number one, do you have a DR plan? Have you ever tested it? When was the last time someone read it? Does it include this kind of scenario in there, actually? If so, do you carry out an annual test to make sure it's up to date and all the latest information that needs to be in there is in there? Do you have a security incident response plan, as we've discussed, right, that specifically deals with ransomware in this case? Do you have a Bitcoin tumbler on the books and with a contract, a retainer agreement already signed with legal, so that you could pay the ransomware if you wanted to or if needed to, because maybe you didn't have backups for the device that had been ransomed and it had lots of critical data. Maybe it was the CEO's laptop and they had just recently been doing very significant business communications and document development on a new product or an acquisition or something, right? And you don't want to get arrested for funding terrorism. So if you don't have that Bitcoin tumbler, under procurement ahead of time, you may miss the ransomware date. Which reminds me, May 1st was supposed to be the Apple ransomware date, and I'm curious if they paid it. I'll have to go look for that information. It was Quanta Computers out of Taiwan, quantatw.com. I think was the name of the URL. I'll have to go see what happened with that story. What else? What steps will you take if you're restoring from backup? If that's not an option, or if it is an option, how long does it take to restore the backups? Where are the backups? Does anyone know how to get at them? Does your security incident response plan take into account the financial implications of a cybersecurity incident? Have you spoken to your cyber insurance provider lately? Did you renew your policy? Yeah, we forgot to renew it, and now we can't file a claim. Let's see. Does it consider the severity of the situation in the policy as well? Do you have a plan and take a place to acquire, like I said, the Bitcoin needed with a Bitcoin tumbler? And have you considered that a targeted ransomware attack may also require more Bitcoin than is easily accessible on the market for you at the moment? Well, I think the Bitcoin and multiple cryptocurrencies are flying high at the moment, so I don't think that's too much of an issue at the moment. All right, so flood zone. A couple more questions. Do you have a backup for completing core business processes without a computer system because you've lost all of your systems temporarily? Can you route emergency communications through a neighboring entity or a parent or sister organization temporarily? And who do you need to notify, and how are you going to do that, considering that you don't have an email platform and your office is closed? Do you need to stand up a quick and dirty alternate domain name that you have parked for a while so that you can actually begin business operations temporarily until the full restores can happen, which might take days, if not weeks? And then, of course, consider that increased phone traffic may congest the lines, given that the disaster, the flooding, and the ransomware shutdown could just cause your customer support to be overwhelmed if you do have a customer support line, an 800 number or something. All right, so I'm heading into the last, 5 slides or so, 4 slides. And we can do a little bit of time on InfoSec in the news and talk about this, what's it called? Colonial Pipeline ransomware event. All right, so red team exercise. In this case, you assume compromise and the attacker has the ability to control a device inside the organization. Given the myriad ways in which a system can be compromised, such as phishing or a watering hole attack or a drive-by download, the premise that this might happen is clearly not far-fetched. And the red team generally mimics this initial compromise by simply bringing in a system into the environment and plugging it into the target network. So you don't really sweat the first step of who is patient zero. You let there be a patient zero and you watch and understand how they move within your organization from there forward. The red team, of course, before it begins, you need to identify your targets. And you need to identify and establish the ROE, the rules of engagement for the exercise. Because you don't want someone getting arrested for doing something that's illegal that was a part of your red team exercise just because you didn't identify that they couldn't do it, right? Or that they shouldn't do it, right? Like attacking a third party that's a part of your infrastructure, and they don't necessarily know that. And then they get all angry that you didn't tell them that you were doing the red team exercise. And they could potentially break a contract with you, sue you, or other awful outcomes. Let's see. So the goal should be to pick something that keeps you up at night, right? Red team targets are not trivial stuff, right? The gist of the idea is to think big. Give the red team a relatively constrained exercise is more akin to green lighting a pen test, right? So said another way, if you give the red team an exercise like steal user X's password, they might come back in 4 hours and hand it to you. So that's why we say dream big. Nice photo here of the crown jewels for England. And then, of course, red team timing provides sufficient time for the red team to accomplish the goals of the exercise. It's the number of moves that the red team needs to make from the compromised system to achieving the target that you have to set for them that will determine how many lessons you learn from the exercise. Given the advice to think big, you must also be a bit realistic. You need to give the red team enough time to have a realistic chance of accomplishing the goal you set for them, or goals. Most red team exercises take at least 2 weeks to execute. The more elaborate ones may run for a couple of months, actually. Red team status. So depending on the length of the engagement, you might want to have a weekly status call or more than once a week, depending on how long it's going to run. Since the investment you make in a red team exercise is not trivial, financially or time-wise, you should plan to track the red team's progress and consider dropping hints if they get stuck at a certain point in the attack scenario. While providing clues may feel like cheating, carefully note that what the red team was not able to accomplish while helping them get unstuck. So you can make a note of it, right? So that they can get to the latter parts of the exercise where they could become, administrator, domain administrator on your Windows Active Directory platform, for example. There will likely be lessons in the back half of the exercise that you would have otherwise not been able to learn, and you want to get return for your investment, right? What is the value of paying for a red team exercise? So if they do need a nudge and say, okay, we'll help you get this piece, you can document that, and then you can let them deliver additional value on the back end of the rest of the test. After the red team exercise is done, you want to have a readout. So once the report has been drafted, reviewed, and approved, then the red team exercise executive readout can be scheduled. The first stage in building a red team report is knowing what to put in the report. 3 of the most important things to discuss in the report are identified vulnerabilities, actions taken, and any identified compliance gaps. The full report should be accepted by the sponsor of the exercise, and then an executive summary deck prepared for senior management. The delivery of that presentation should be practiced at least once before the real thing in order to give the presenters a chance to field questions from the technical context of your organization before being placed in front of the senior management team. Shown here, the boardroom from Stanley Kubrick's 1964 comedy noir, Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb. I think it was Uber, if I remember correctly, that actually built a conference room that looked a lot like this, and they did it on purpose because they wanted to have a very Dr. Strangelove vibe, which is, now that you look at some of the things that have happened in that company, and exits of executives and arrests and stalking and things like that, it's definitely part of their character, of the culture of the company, apparently. All right, so we have reached InfoSec in the news, and we got about 15-16 minutes to run through a couple of stories, and the one that I most wanted to do, which is to switch to full share and take a look at our Slack channel. And so it's this pipeline story, right? ZD has a good story on it, so let's take a look at it real quick. All right, Colonial Pipeline cyber attack shuts down pipeline that supplies 45% of the East Coast's fuel. The attack highlights how ransomware and other attacks, other cyber attacks, are increasingly a threat to real-world infrastructure. So Colonial Pipeline accounts for 45% of all the East Coast fuel. It shut down its operations because of the attack. So the attack didn't shut down the operations, but in their abundance of caution, they wanted to not lose control of their pipeline and the infrastructure. The attack highlights, of course, the dependencies, fuel and home heating for the military and for private sector. On May 7th, the pipeline company learned it was a victim of a cybersecurity attack. In response, we proactively took certain systems offline to contain the threat, which has temporarily halted all pipeline operations and affected some of our IT systems. So they don't say what systems, right? We're talking about disclosure, non-public, non-material public information. This is what you want to share in this press release. Some info, but not too much. Upon learning of the issue, a leading third-party cybersecurity firm was engaged. I happen to know that was Mandiant FireEye. That's reported in other articles. It's considered public information if you know how to read 3 or 4 different articles where it is disclosed. And they have already launched an investigation into the nature and scope of the incident, which is ongoing. We've contacted law enforcement and other federal agencies. So again, incident response plan, light it up, Colonial. And Colonial Pipeline is taking steps to understand and resolve this issue. At this time, our primary focus is the safe, blah, 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 efficient restoration of service, blah, blah, blah. This process is already underway. Of course, the potential economic impact of this for the Eastern Seaboard is huge, right? They have 4 or 5 days worth of fuel in their tanks, probably in their storage facilities at the end of this pipeline here in New Jersey for the New York Harbor and greater eastern areas that this pipeline supplies. But the impact on this is going to be huge in the next 4 or 5 days if Mandiant doesn't get them back in the air soon and online. Here's a picture of the pipeline. I think it's something on the order of 5,000 miles. Is that right? I think it was a different story that had even more info. Politico.com, Colonial Pipeline, I think was the other story that I saw. Yeah, this one uses the word jugular. The jugular of the U.S. fuel pipeline shuts down after a cyber attack. Very dramatic, yeah. 5,500 miles, and it's stopped at the moment. What was interesting in here, Biden received a briefing on the incident Saturday morning. That would be this morning. A White House spokesperson said, adding it's working actively to assess the implications and restoring as quickly as possible. Shut down more than a few days could send gasoline prices in the southeastern U.S. above $3 a gallon, a marketing analyst said. That could deepen the political risks the incident poses. Let's see what else. They'll learn that in the first 24 to 74 hours, said Rob Lee, CEO of the cybersecurity firm Dragos. What's interesting, I know Rob Lee, and we're both on the World Economic Forum, and he's one of the other companies that was named the technology pioneer. Dragos.com is a great organization, and he's a really smart guy. He used to be involved in the military, if I understand correctly, in doing security. And he founded this company and is the CEO of it. And he was quoted here, but they've not been engaged to the best of my knowledge, because this is not an operations technology thing. This is not an IoT SCADA systems kind of thing. This is the IT side of Colonial Pipeline that got hit. And that's why Mandiant FireEye was brought in. So yeah, in the next 24 hours, we're going to know what's going on here. He thinks it's going to be relatively short-lived, hopefully. They were hopefully able to contain it. They brought in some really good folks to do that. Can they move in the incident response plan scenarios from containment to eradication to restoration of services? But it's just the latest in the episode of Russia shutting off things in the Ukraine and other kinds of things that are maybe dress rehearsals for cyber warfare. We're not exactly sure who the threat actor is. I've checked with some of my sources, and it could be hacktivism due to a pipeline spill that happened for several months, spilling gasoline into nature areas. But it could also be a group called, I think, Dark Side. I think they might have been called out in one of these write-ups as well. Let's see if that's in here. Dark Side. Yeah. The Department of Homeland Security believes that the intrusion is the work of criminal ransomware gang known as Dark Side and not a nation state. But then again, in information politics and disinformation campaigns, saying that it's Dark Side and not nation state could be a pretty clear indicator that it is actually a nation state doing this, flexing its muscle, potentially influencing policy around sanctions. I know there's been some activity recently calling out security equipment being bought by countries and entities that are on sanctions lists. And there's been a retaliation against the folks that publish those reports with a denial of service attack and things. So we're going to learn more in the future coming days, a few coming up days, as to what's going on with this story. I think they actually updated this story since I last read it earlier today, because it now includes even more information. But this is a bit that's interesting, right? Colonial delivers products to terminals every 5 days, and they can get ships to take and deliver gas through the port, but that's only going to buffer it slightly. It's not enough for that's the whole reason the pipeline exists, right? It's to send a whole bunch of fuel all the time. Anyway, so every 5 days. So there may be some terminals that had been depending on deliveries for yesterday, today, or tomorrow that will be immediately affected. But on a widespread basis, in 4 to 5 days, you'll see signs of impact, especially as consumers get wind of what's going on and they start filling up their cars because they don't want to have to pay for super expensive gasoline to get around and do stuff. Thankfully, there's not a lot of people driving cars these days, right, given lockdown. And so that's a potential benefit, I guess, of us being on COVID lockdown right now. All right, so what other stories do I want to touch on? There's a bleeping computer example on the same one, and stolen data. Ransomware games have stolen data for 2,100 companies so far since 2019. That's a nice story about measuring the trends over time. Microsoft removes remaining Windows 10 connection update blocks. Okay, not today's topic. Today's topic is information security policy, right? And social media policy and breach disclosure incident response. Security Week has a story as well on the same one. This is one of the reasons why I love having the InfoSec news channel. Is just you can kind of tell the big story when it lands on 5 or 6 different feeds at the same time. Let's see. Facebook will limit your WhatsApp features for not accepting privacy policy. This is a battle between Facebook and Apple. I read something that the first few people that have upgraded to the latest iOS, 94% of them, I think, opted out of tracking, which is huge, right? This is a big war going on. And what would this be? This would be business continuity planning for Facebook, because if they're going to lose 94% of their ad revenue data, at least on the iPhone market, that is a huge deal. So let's see, where's the link for this story? Let's open it. Facebook will limit your WhatsApp features for not accepting the privacy policy. So On Friday, they disclosed it won't deactivate accounts or users who don't accept it. It's going to continue to keep reminding them to accept it. Oh man, so it's going to nag them. No one will have their accounts deleted or lose functionality on May 15th because of the update. The move marked a turnaround from its previous stance, and so they're backing down. But this is also, like, I think, related to what Apple is doing with their security posture. Like I said, 80-some%, maybe 90% of people don't want to be tracked. And I guess people are willing to pay for that privilege. But not everyone has the disposable income of an Apple user, right? There's lots of Android users out there that don't necessarily mind too much to have their data bought and sold in order to get free services like email and apps and social media and things like that. This is definitely going to change the landscape. This battle going on between Apple and its privacy initiatives and Facebook and other companies that rely on the ad revenue and all of this tracking and ad tech, to know who clicked on what, who liked what page in order to sell that information about you. So I don't have a terribly strong belief about the negative side of ad tracking. I can't remember. I think I actually said, yes, I'm okay to be tracked for a while because I wanted to observe it, actually. All right, back into the stories. Security flaws Russian spy hackers are exploiting in the wild. That looks like an interesting story, but maybe not information security policy related. We're looking maybe for incidents of things that have to do with, I mean, obviously in an incident response here, this is a good one, this tunneling story. This new pingback malware is using Ping's ICMP protocol to tunnel and evade command and control detection, because ping traffic is usually not blocked on most organizations. So they have a small 60K DLL called OCI.dll, and so this is a Windows vulnerability. So your best mitigation to this is to just not run Windows. But anyway, it's being called pingback, and it leverages ping to do things that ping's not supposed to be doing, like be a command and control channel for malware. So this shows you some interesting details about it. Virus total, let's see, isn't blah, blah, blah. While MSDTC isn't configured to run automatically on startup, a virus total sample submitted in July 2020 was found to install the DLL into the Windows system directory and start the MSDTC service to achieve persistence. The pingback, basically lives off the land by being called from an existing, right? The payload's not executable, it's a DLL. So it needs to take advantage of the fact that the DLL is going to read, the executable is going to read this DLL, this distributed linked library. Upon successful execution, pingback resorts to using the ICMP protocol for its main communication, and it's usually just for trace routing, right, and debugging for ping. And it's not meant to be overloaded with messages that are used for command and control. But that's one way for them to get out of the network if they have egress monitoring in place, which people should have, right? Your outbound traffic should be monitored as well. If it's going to command and control servers on sinkholes like the ones that we operate, we can see that that stuff is happening and that you've been infected by a particular type of malware, and our sinkhole picks that up. All right, so I think we have time for one more story. 11 flaws, Russian cyber exploiting in the wild, no. 21 nails, XM bug. Yeah, this is the one that I wrote about, actually. Let's see if there's a new story. Under security scorecard, we published a blog post on Friday about this XM story. And I worked on it with our head of threat intelligence, Ryan. And so we're talking about XM, which is a mail transfer agent on Linux, used in about 60% on the internet, actually. They were working with Qualys, and they came up with 21 vulnerabilities. I think it was 11 remote code executions and 10 privilege escalations, or the other way around. And they dubbed it 21 nails. And if you put them together, you could get this awful thing, right? Unauthorized remote code execution on the XM server. And the fact that there's so many of these XM servers out there is a big risk. But what's so interesting is that open source is actually proving to be a lot more resilient than Microsoft system administrators. So I've seen in our scanning in the last 4 or 5 days since the release of the fix was published and disclosed on May 4th. So what is today? May 8th is 4 days later. Like 38% of all of the XM instances that we can observe have already been patched to the latest level, which is huge, right? I think even 20% had actually been achieved within 24 hours, which means that some people are patching their XM servers for critical updates nightly, and others are weekly. So I presume, and I assume that by the time we reach day 7 or 8 of this availability of this patch, that the XM vulnerability will be dealt with. And just imagine, when did the Microsoft one start? I think that was beginning of March, and there's still thousands of Microsoft instances that haven't been patched. And so that's a real difference, I guess, between the trust that people have in the open source community to set things to auto update, essentially, and to trust that they're not going to break. We've seen that it's in 63 countries at the moment. Some of the details of the exploit are not actually easy. They're hard to move beyond the proof of concept exploit. Qualys, the researchers that found it, had basically been working with XM's project development team, which is a bunch of volunteers. I think XM was started as a mail package from University of, I want to say a UK university. What is it? XM.org. University of Cambridge. And so there could well be some British volunteers that are involved in maintaining that code right now, that we're working since October with Qualys to help fix and patch these vulnerabilities. And so I think everyone should get on 4.9, 4.2, of course, and some of these operating system distributions that it comes bundled with by default as the mail transfer agent for inbound and outbound is already available for CentOS, Red Hat, and SUSE Linux distributions. All right. So those are 2 recent stories that popped, and this one I wanted to read and see if there's anything new in here. But basically, same story. 11 vulnerabilities here that require local access, and 10 that could be exploited remotely. And let's see, the issue were discovered by Qualys and reported to XM in October, and they've been working on getting it all fixed since then. I think I also read that the developers or some of the project maintainers started to get really burned out fixing the vulns and said, okay, let's not go for 22. Let's not, let's just stop now, release a patch, get it out, and go back to being able to do the regular day job, right? Because a lot of times open source stuff is maintained by people that volunteer. Nearly 60% of publicly reachable, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, this just looks like a parroting of some of the other stories that have been written about this topic. All right, fine students and learners, we have reached the last minute of the last hour of the last lecture for the semester for this class. So thank you very much for those of you that have joined the lectures in person. And of course, that's no slight for anyone that watched these as recordings. The whole point is to make this flexible so that you can consume the material and do the homework at your own time, at your own pace. Life has been difficult this last year, and some of you have COVID, some of you have lost your jobs, some of you have family that are sick. And so I hope that this has been easy for you and not a burden. I want you to do the work, but I also want to give you a chance to have some flexibility in submitting this. I look forward to your final projects and grading them and getting them out in the next 72 hours or so as they come in. And from what I've seen, you've done a very good job. So I'm proud of the work that you've done in self-organizing your project teams, and the deliverables are outstanding from what I can tell so far. And so it looks like everyone will be doing quite well if you get your homework in, and I double check your attendance by downloading the lectures and listening to them at your own time. Anyway, so that's it. It is Saturday, May 8th. I have been Professor Mike Wilkes, and it's been my pleasure to share information, tell stories, and to teach this class for you. So take care, stay in touch. Feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm happy to continue with you in my network. And as you look for work or have questions, feel free to reach out to me, and I'll be happy to respond, knowing that we spent some time together, maybe not in synchronous communication, but definitely in asynchronous. And so you're a part of my network now. So thank you very much. And be safe, do well, and stay healthy. Cheers.